The queen lost a daughter years ago. Today, a human brought her home. The massive blue-furred saber-toothed tracks were fresh in the azure moss. Mark Chen moved silently through the dense foliage, each step calculated. The bone spear in his hand, crafted from the thigh of a six-legged beast he'd killed 3 winters ago, felt light despite its size. His weathered face, mapped with scars, remained expressionless as he followed his prey to its mountain den. 5 years ago, he'd been Dr. Mark Chen, xenobiologist on the UNSC Explorer mission. Now, after the ship's destruction and desperate evacuation, he was simply Mark, survivor. This saber-tooth had been competing for his settlement's limited food supply for too long. It needed to end today. The cave entrance loomed ahead, larger than expected, a gaping maw in the mountainside with fresh blood staining the rocks. Mark removed his crude bone arrow bow and entered slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The unmistakable scent of a predator's den filled his nostrils, but something else caught his attention. Clashing teeth and grunts that sounded almost vocal. Mark rounded a corner and froze. The saber-tooth, even larger up close than he'd estimated, stood with massive fangs bared. But it wasn't alone. Facing it, crouched on all fours with bloody meat between them, was a humanoid figure. Female but feral, her body covered in dirt and dried blood, her tangled hair hanging past her waist. Her visible skin through tattered clothing was pale blue. A Kalani, one of the native intelligent species of this world. But unlike the sophisticated beings that populated the distant city fortress of Salona, this female moved like an animal. She snarled at the saber-tooth, revealing sharpened teeth, her yellow eyes showing no trace of sentience. The standoff was about to turn deadly. The saber-tooth's muscles bunched for a killing strike. Without hesitation, Mark raised his bow and fired. The arrow struck the beast's eye. It roared, whirling toward this new threat. Mark had already dropped the bow and gripped his spear with both hands. The wounded predator charged. Mark braced the spear against the cave floor. The impact nearly tore the weapon from his grasp as momentum drove the spear deep into the beast's chest. Its massive body slammed into Mark, sending him crashing against the wall. Stars exploded across his vision. The beast thrashed in death throes, claws raking inches from Mark's face before collapsing. Mark pushed himself to his knees, blood trickling from his temple. Through his pain, he saw the Salani female seizing the contested meat, retreating deeper into the cave. "Wait!" he called in the Salani language he'd learned during rare trading excursions. She froze, then turned. Her eyes reflected the dim light like a nocturnal animal's. She bared her teeth and growled. "I won't harm you," he said, though doubting she understood. She didn't. With a snarl, she launched herself at him, abandoning the meat to eliminate this new competitor. Her attack was pure animal instinct, powerful but uncoordinated. Mark rolled aside and caught her in a restraining hold. She fought like a wild thing, all teeth and claws, but he maintained his grip. "Calm," he repeated firmly in Salani. "Calm." Nearly 10 minutes passed before her struggles weakened. As she stilled, panting, Mark noticed something on her shoulder. A pattern visible through the grime. Not random markings, but a tattoo. Faded but recognizable to anyone who had traded in Salona. The royal crest of the ruling house. Mark's breath caught. This wasn't just any feral Salani. Given her age, early 20s by human standards, she could only be Princess Leandra, heir to the throne, who had vanished during an expedition over a decade ago. The implications staggered him. The princess, presumed dead, had been living like an animal in the wilderness. And he, a human, a species barely tolerated by the Salani elite, had found her. Mark looked down at the wild creature in his arms, seeing past the filth to the lost royal beneath. His purpose crystallized with sudden clarity. He would return her to Salona. Not just her body, but her mind, her very essence. It would be the hardest journey of his life. The first 3 days were pure hell. Mark had bound Leandra's hands with leather strips, allowing some movement but preventing attacks. She fought constantly, alternating between escape attempts and trying to bite any part of him she could reach. He fashioned a crude stretcher for supplies and the most valuable parts of the saber-tooth, fangs and claws for trading. When Leandra refused to walk beside him, dropping to the ground, he simply hoisted her onto the stretcher as well, securing her with additional bindings. "You're not making this easy, princess," he muttered as they made camp on the third night. She glared from where she lay bound, yellow eyes reflecting the campfire. He had managed to clean some dirt from her face while she slept the previous night, revealing more of the delicate blue patterns marking Zalani royalty. Mark sat cross-legged across the fire, cutting strips from a bird-like creature he had caught. He skewered a piece on a stick and held it over the flames. "When I was first stranded here, I nearly starved because I didn't know what was safe to eat," he said conversationally. "Trial and error is a harsh teacher." Leandra showed no sign of understanding, her gaze fixed on the cooking meat, nostrils flaring at the aroma. "I wonder how long you have been alone," Mark continued. "Reports said you disappeared 12 years ago. You couldn't have been more than a child." He tested the meat with his fingertip, found it adequately cooked, and took a bite. Leandra's eyes tracked his every movement, making a low sound of hunger or aggression. Mark cooked another strip and moved closer to her. She immediately tensed, teeth bared. "Easy," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you. Just thought you might like to try something other than raw meat." He placed the meat on a flat stone beside her, then retreated. After suspicious glaring, Leandra bent her head and sniffed the offering. Her first bite was cautious, but the second eager. She devoured it with obvious pleasure, then looked up expectantly. He smiled and prepared another piece. That's the first step, recognizing that something different can be good. By the fifth day, Leandra had stopped actively trying to escape. She still wouldn't walk willingly alongside Mark, but no longer fought when lifted onto the stretcher. More importantly, she watched him with something other than murderous intent. Wary curiosity had entered her gaze. On the seventh day, they encountered their first major obstacle. The route to Shalona required crossing a wide river, swollen with mountain snowmelt. The bridge Mark had used during previous journeys had been washed away. "Well, princess," Mark said, surveying the rushing water, "we need another way across." Leandra stood beside him, her hands connected by a longer strip that gave her more freedom. She showed no comprehension of the problem, her attention caught by silvery fish beneath the water's surface. Mark headed upstream, searching for a narrower crossing. Leandra followed, not from obedience, but because the fish moved in the same direction. After nearly 2 hours, they reached a section where the river narrowed and large boulders broke the water's flow. "This will do," Mark decided, unloading essential supplies and securing them in a waterproof pouch made from the saber-toothed bladder. "We'll need to cross carefully. The current could sweep us away if we slip." He considered her bindings. If she fell while restrained, she would drown. But if freed completely, she might flee or attack while he was vulnerable. "I'm going to trust you," he said, meeting her eyes. "Not because I think you understand, but because we need to trust each other to survive." He untied the leather straps. Leandra immediately pulled her hands apart, rubbing the chafed skin. She looked at Mark with that same wary curiosity, perhaps surprised by this freedom. "Follow me," he gestured toward the river. "Step where I step." He entered the water, gasping at its frigid temperature. The first boulder was about 10 feet from shore, and he waded carefully toward it, fighting the current. Upon reaching it, he turned to see if Leandra followed. She stood at the water's edge, one foot testing the surface. Her expression showed clear distaste for the cold, but after hesitating, she entered. Her movements differed from Mark's, less calculation and more instinctual adjustment, like a wild animal crossing challenging terrain. They reached the first boulder without incident. Mark caught his breath, then pointed to the next. "That's our next stop." When Mark began moving, Leandra followed. The distance to the second boulder was greater, the current stronger. Mark felt his footing slip once, but quickly recovered. Behind him, Leandra navigated with surprising agility, her body lowered to the water, using her hands against the riverbed. They reached the second boulder, then the third. At the midpoint of the river, with the worst behind them, Mark allowed himself a small triumph. That's when he heard the rumbling. Upstream, a wall of water surged around the bend, a flash flood triggered by some distant cloudburst. Mark had just enough time to shout a warning before the wave hit. The force tore him from the boulder. He tumbled through the current, fighting to keep his head above water. Through spray and chaos, he glimpsed Leandra, also swept downstream, but somehow managing to avoid submersion. Mark crashed into a partially submerged tree trunk, the impact driving air from his lungs. He clung to the rough bark, pulling his upper body out of the water. Gasping, he scanned the churning river for Leandra. There, about 50 yards downstream, she had caught herself on a tangle of branches near shore. But the wood was giving way under the flood's pressure. Mark launched himself back into the current, using the water's force to propel him toward her. He struck out with powerful strokes, angling his body across the flow. He reached the branch tangle just as it began tearing away from shore. Leandra's eyes widened at his approach. With fear or surprise, he couldn't tell. Mark grabbed her arm with one hand and a sturdy root protruding from the riverbank with the other. "Hold on to me," he shouted, though knowing she wouldn't understand. He pulled her closer, wrapping his arm around her waist. To his astonishment, instead of fighting his grip, she clung to him, fingers digging into his shoulders with desperate strength. With his free hand, Mark pulled them along the root system toward shore, fighting the current every inch. When they finally dragged themselves onto solid ground, both collapsed in exhaustion. Mark lay on his back, chest heaving. Beside him, Leandra curled on her side, trembling with cold and exertion. "We made it," Mark panted. "We're alive." He turned to look at her. Leandra met his gaze, and for the first time, Mark saw something besides animal wariness or rage. There was recognition, an acknowledgement that he had saved her life. It wasn't gratitude exactly, but it was the first hint that somewhere beneath the feral exterior, Princess Leandra still existed. That night, Mark built a large fire to dry their soaked clothing and warm their bodies. They had lost most supplies in the crossing, including the stretcher and saber-tooth parts. All that remained was what Mark carried in the waterproof pouch: dried meat, a flint striker, his knife, and a crude map drawn on cured hide. "We'll need to forage as we go now," he told Leandra, as he laid their clothing on rocks near the fire. He had stripped to his undergarments, and after coaxing, had removed her sodden rags as well. He kept his eyes averted, draping his spare shirt over her shoulders. "At least we're on the right side of the river," he continued, studying his map. "Salona lies about 20 days' journey southeast, assuming we maintain a decent pace." Leandra sat huddled by the fire, clutching the borrowed shirt. The flames reflected in her eyes, but unlike before, she wasn't staring with animal fascination. She seemed lost in thought, her gaze unfocused. Mark hesitated, then sat beside her, still at a respectful distance. "I wonder what you're thinking," he said softly. "If you're thinking at all, in the way I understand thought." He poked at the fire, sending sparks into the night air. "There are our theories about feral children on Earth. Some were rehabilitated, others never fully recovered. The younger they were when separated, the harder it was." Leandra's eyes shifted to watch the sparks rise and fade. "But you were older when you were lost, and the Zalani mind is remarkably adaptive," Mark added. "I should sleep. Tomorrow will be another long day." As he moved to his side of the fire, Leandra made a soft sound, not a growl or hiss, but something almost like a whimper. Mark paused, looking back. "Are you cold?" She made the sound again, her eyes now fixed on him. Slowly, Mark returned to sit beside her. Leandra watched intently, then shifted slightly closer until their shoulders almost touched. Mark remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. This was the first time she had voluntarily moved toward him rather than away. "It's okay," he said gently. "I'm here." They sat that way through the night, the fire gradually dying. When dawn broke, Mark awoke to find Leandra's head resting against his shoulder, her breathing deep and peaceful in sleep. The next phase of their journey brought new challenges and unexpected developments in Leandra's behavior. Mark fashioned new clothing for her from the hides of animals they caught. Though crude, the garments provided better protection than his oversized shirt. To his surprise, Leandra accepted them without resistance, even seeming to appreciate their warmth during increasingly cool nights. She began walking alongside him rather than lagging behind. More remarkably, she started mimicking his actions, watching intently as he set snares for small game, then attempting to replicate the technique herself. Her first efforts were clumsy, but by the fourth try, she successfully trapped a rabbit-like creature with 6 legs. The pride in her eyes when she presented her catch spoke volumes. Mark praised her in both human and Silani languages, though seeing no indication she comprehended the words themselves. 10 days into their journey, they entered a vast grassland of knee-high blue vegetation stretching to the horizon. The tall stalks swayed like ocean waves. It was beautiful but exposed, offering little shelter and making them visible from great distances. "We'll need to be cautious here," Mark said, scanning the terrain. "This is perfect hunting ground for aerial predators." They set a brisk pace, hoping to cross the expanse quickly. By midday, the twin suns beat down mercilessly, and they paused in the shadow of a solitary tree with copper-like bark and amethyst-colored leaves. While Leandra rested, Mark climbed the tree for a better view. The grassland extended for many miles, but a line of hills appeared at its southeastern edge, their destination. He was about to descend when the movement in the sky caught his attention. At first, he thought it was a cloud shadow, but the shape resolved into a flock of winged creatures. They were too distant to identify precisely, but their flight pattern was unmistakable. The circular glide of predators that had spotted prey. And they were heading directly toward them. Mark scrambled down, landing with a thud that startled Leandra. "We need to move," he said urgently. "Sky hunters." Leandra followed his gaze upward, and her reaction was immediate, a full-body tensing and low hiss of recognition. She knew these predators. They abandoned the tree's shelter and ran through the grassland, but the movement made them more visible. The flying hunters, now close enough for Mark to see their leathery wings and elongated heads with curved beaks, adjusted course, their circles tightening. "They're faster than we are," Mark said grimly, pulling his bow and nocking an arrow. "We'll have to stand and fight." There were 7 creatures, each with a wingspan of at least 12 feet. Their bodies were serpentine, with no visible limbs beyond powerful wings and vicious talons extending from their underbellies. The first one dove, its shriek piercing the air. Mark tracked its approach, waited until it was within range, then loosed his arrow. The projectile struck the wing joint, sending it tumbling to the ground. But others were already attacking. 2 more plummeted from the sky, one heading for Mark, the other for Leandra. Mark drew his knife, preparing to defend. He never saw the third hunter diving from behind. The impact knocked him forward, and fire exploded across his back as talons raked through his hide shirt into flesh. He rolled, slashing blindly with his knife, and felt it connect. The creature shrieked and pulled away, taking the knife embedded in its underbelly. Dazed and bleeding, Mark struggled to his knees. Through pain-hazed vision, he saw Leandra fending off her attacker with a broken branch, swinging it like a club. But more hunters circled, preparing to dive. One detached from the group and plummeted toward Mark's unprotected back. In his wounded state, he couldn't turn quickly enough. A scream tore through the air, not the shriek of a flying predator, but something almost human. Leandra had seen the danger. With a mighty heave, she hurled her branch like a spear. It struck the diving hunter squarely in the head, sending it veering off course just enough to miss Mark. The creature crashed into the grass nearby, momentarily stunned. Mark staggered to his feet, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "We need to run," he gasped. "Head for those boulders." He pointed to a cluster of rocks about 100 yards away, the only cover visible. They ran, the hunters screaming overhead. Mark's vision swam, dark spots dancing at its edges. His wound burned like acid, blood soaking his tattered shirt. Leandra kept pace beside him, occasionally glancing up at their pursuers. When one dove too close, she snatched a stone from the ground and hurled it with surprising accuracy, forcing the creature to veer away. They reached the boulders just as Mark's strength began failing. He collapsed against the largest rock, breathing in ragged gasps. The flying hunters circled overhead, shrieking in frustration. "They'll wait us out," Mark panted. "They're persistent." Leandra crouched beside him, eyes fixed on the scarby. Then, to Mark's surprise, she turned her attention to his wound. Her fingers probed the torn flesh with unexpected gentleness. "It's bad, isn't it?" Mark asked weakly. "Feels bad." Leandra made a soft sound, then tore a strip from her own garment. She pressed it against the wound, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. Her actions were deliberate, almost clinical. "You understand what you're doing," Mark whispered. "You're helping me." Above them, the hunters continued circling, but seemed unwilling to dive between the boulders. As long as they stayed within this natural fortress, they had a chance. Night fell, and still the predators circled, black shapes against the star-filled sky. Mark drifted in and out of consciousness, fever taking hold as infection set in. Through his haze, he was aware of Leandra's presence, her cool hands on his forehead, her voice making soft, wordless sounds that somehow comforted him. When dawn broke, the hunters were gone, having abandoned the vigil for easier prey. But Mark's condition had worsened. His skin burned with fever, and the wound had turned angry red, with purple streaks extending outward. "Poison," he murmured, recognizing the symptoms. "Their talons must be venomous." Leandra knelt beside him, expression troubled. She placed a hand on his cheek, then made a decisive sound and rose. "Where are you going?" Mark asked, struggling to focus. She pointed beyond the boulders, then mimicked eating. "Food?" "No," she made another gesture, pressing her hands to her chest, then pointing to his wound. "Medicine," Mark realized. "You know something that can help." Leandra nodded, a human gesture she had learned from him. Then with a final glance, she slipped away into the grassland. Mark drifted through consciousness, the poison working through his system. He dreamed of Earth, of the research facility where he had studied xenobiology, of colleagues long dead. When he opened his eyes again, the light had changed to dusk. Leandra was back, kneeling beside him with something clutched in her hands. It was a plant, tubular stems ending in bulbous pods of vivid magenta. She broke one open, revealing thick, greenish paste in mud. Without hesitation, she spread this paste over Mark's wound. The effect was immediate and agonizing. Mark arched his back, a scream tearing from his throat as liquid fire poured into his veins. Leandra held him down with surprising strength, making soothing noises as he writhed. Then the pain receded, replaced by cool numbness spreading outward from the wound. Mark collapsed back, his breathing steadying. "What was that?" he gasped. Leandra showed him the plant again, then pointed to similar ones growing at the base of the boulders. Easy to miss unless you knew exactly what to look for. "You knew," Mark said wonderingly. "You remembered this plant and what it does." That night, as Mark slept deeply, his body finally healing, a raindrop struck his face. He woke to find the sky obscured by rolling black clouds, an acid storm brewing. Such downpours were deadly to exposed flesh. "We need better shelter," he said, struggling to sit up. They found it in a narrow crevice between two boulders, a space just wide enough for them to squeeze into, with an overhang for protection. Mark crawled in first, wincing as rough stones scraped his injured back. Leandra followed, pressing close in the confined space. The storm broke with savage intensity. Droplets hissed as they struck rocks outside, releasing acrid fumes that made Mark's eyes water. "Here," Mark said, tearing a strip from his shirt. "Cover your mouth and nose." She took the cloth, but seemed unsure what to do. Mark demonstrated with his own piece, tying it around the lower half of his face. Leandra watched, then perfectly mimicked his actions. They huddled together as the storm raged, temperature dropping rapidly. Leandra shivered, her slender frame offering little insulation. Without thinking, Mark wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her closer to share body heat. She stiffened momentarily, then relaxed against him, her head resting on his chest. Her hair, no longer tangled, but beginning to show its natural wave pattern, as Mark had helped clean it in streams, tickled his chin. "We'll reach Salona soon," Mark said through his mask. "Another 10 days, perhaps less if we maintain a good pace." Leandra made no response, but her hand moved to rest on his arm, a deliberate gesture of connection. The storm intensified, rain pounding against the rocks. Mark pulled Leandra closer as wind drove acid droplets toward their shelter. "I've seen you changing," he told her. "Day by day, you're remembering how to be Silani, not just surviving. You're remembering how to connect, how to help, how to think beyond the immediate moment." Leandra shifted, tilting her face up toward his. In lightning flashes, Mark could see her eyes, no longer merely reflecting light like an animal's, but holding something deeper, something questioning. She reached up slowly and touched his face, fingers tracing his jaw with gentle curiosity. Then, to his astonishment, she spoke. Not words, but a soft, melodic sound that was unmistakably an attempt at communication. "Yes," Mark whispered, heart pounding. "That's it. You're trying to speak." She made the sound again, brow furrowing with concentration. Then her fingers moved to her own throat, as if trying to understand how to form words. Leandra, Mark said, touching her shoulder gently. Your name is Leandra. She blinked, tilting her head. The sound she made next was nowhere close to her name, but it was intentional, an effort to mimic his speech pattern. You're coming back, he said softly, step by step. As the storm subsided and dawn approached, they remained huddled together. Mark drifted into sleep, his mind filled with hope for the first time since beginning this impossible journey. He woke to find Leandra watching him, her gaze intent. When she saw he was awake, she made another attempt at speech, a different sound this time, closer to actual Ceylani language. Good morning to you too, Mark smiled, sitting carefully. His back felt better, the wound beginning to scab thanks to the medicinal plant. They emerged to find the landscape transformed by acid rain. The blue grass had been seared in patches, revealing rusty soil beneath. Mark studied his crude map, orienting by the rising suns. We should reach the foothills by nightfall, he said, pointing southeast. From there, it's downhill to Shalona. Leandra followed his gesture, eyes narrowing as she gazed toward distant hills. Something in her posture changed, a straightening of her spine, a lifting of her chin. For a brief moment, Mark could see the princess she had once been. That night, as they sat beside the fire roasting tubers Leandra had gathered, she made a sound that closely resembled the Ceylani word for yes. When Mark stared in surprise, she repeated it more confidently. Yes, Mark echoed in Ceylani, then in English. Yes, that's right. A hint of a smile touched Leandra's lips, the first Mark had seen. It transformed her face, bringing light to her eyes and softening the wild angles of her expression. The next day brought them into the hills, and from their elevated position, they caught their first glimpse of Shalona, a sprawling city of crystalline spires and terraced gardens, surrounded by massive walls that shimmered like mother of pearl even at this distance. Mark felt Leandra tense beside him as the city came into view. Her breathing quickened, and she made a series of sounds that were almost words, her hand clutching at Mark's arm. You recognize it, he said. On some level, you know that's your home. They stood together on the hilltop, gazing at the distant city. Then Leandra did something that took Mark's breath away. She pointed at Shalona and said clearly and distinctly, home. It was the first true word she had spoken, not just a sound or approximation, but an actual word in the human language Mark had been using with one. Yes, he replied, voice thick with emotion. Home. The final approach to Shalona took them through cultivated fields where Ceylani farmers tended crystal-like plants that chimed softly in the breeze. The farmers stopped to stare as they passed, expressions of mixture of curiosity and suspicion. News of their arrival spread quickly, and by the time they reached the outer gate, a contingent of guards waited for them. The Ceylani guards were tall and imposing, their blue skin darker than Leandra's, marked with patterns of common citizenship rather than royalty. They carried spears of unknown metal, points gleaming with inner light. Halt, human, the lead guard commanded in heavily accented English. State your business in Shalona. Mark stepped forward, keeping his posture non-threatening. I seek an audience with Queen Zenaya, he said formally in Ceylani. I bring news of great importance to the royal house. The guard's eyes narrowed. The queen does not receive humans. His gaze shifted to Leandra, half hidden behind Mark. Who is this with you? She wears the garb of a savage. She is my reason for coming, Mark replied. Please inform the royal steward that I have information regarding Princess Leandra. At the name, a ripple of reaction passed through the guards. The leader studied Leandra more carefully, taking in her blue skin and gradually emerging facial features as weeks of proper nutrition had begun restoring her appearance. Wait here, he said finally. He disappeared through the gate, returning with a Ceylani female dressed in elaborate court robes. I am Serene, royal steward, she announced coolly. You claim to have information about our lost princess? I do not merely have information, Mark bowed respectfully. I believe I have found her. He stepped aside, revealing Leandra more fully. The steward's composure faltered as she took in the young woman's appearance. The matted hair, crude animal hide clothing, wary stance. But then her gaze fixed on the partial tattoo visible on Leandra's shoulder, and her eyes widened. Impossible, she whispered. The princess was lost in the Scarlet Wastes 12 years ago. No one survives there, especially not a child. And yet, Mark said quietly, here she stands. Serene approached Leandra slowly, hand outstretched. Leandra shrank back, a low growl rising in her throat. The steward froze, expression shifting from wonder to dismay. What has happened to her, she demanded. Why does she behave like an animal? She has survived alone in the wilderness for 12 years, Mark explained. She has forgotten language, forgotten her identity, but she is learning again, remembering. She spoke her first word just yesterday. Serene's eyes narrowed with suspicion. This could be a deception. A Silani outcast painted with royal markings, coached to play a role. Test her lineage, Mark suggested. The royal house has distinct genetic markers that cannot be falsified. The steward considered this, then nodded sharply. The queen must be informed. You will both come with me, but know this, human. If this is a deception, the punishment will be severe. They were escorted through the gates of Shalona into a city more magnificent than Mark had imagined. The architecture was organic and flowing, buildings seeming to grow from the ground rather than being constructed upon it. Zilani citizens stopped to stare as the procession passed. Leandra pressed close to Mark's side, her eyes darting from structure to structure, breathing rapid. Occasionally she would make small sounds of recognition or confusion, as if memory fragments were struggling to surface. The royal palace dominated the center, a vast complex of crystalline towers and suspended gardens, connected by bridges that seemed made of solidified light. As they approached the main entrance, Leandra suddenly stopped, her gaze fixed on an intricate mosaic adorning the archway. It depicted the royal family, a tall, regal queen, her consort, and between them a small female child with the same delicate facial structure as Leandra. The child wore an expression of innocent mon, hand raised in greeting. Leandra stepped forward, reaching out to touch the image. Me? She said softly, the words still awkward but unmistakable. Serene gasped, composure breaking. By the ancient stars, she whispered. It truly is her. They were led deeper into the palace until they reached massive doors inscribed with the royal crest. Guards flanked the entrance, ceremonial armor gleaming. Wait here, Serene instructed. I must prepare the queen. She disappeared through the doors, leaving them under the watchful eyes of royal guards. Mark turned to Leandra, noting the tension in her posture, the fear in her eyes. It's all right, he said softly, taking her hand. You're safe, you're home. She clutched his hand tightly, then touched her own chest. Leandra, she said, the name still imperfect, but recognizable. Yes, Mark smiled. You are Leandra. The doors swung open and Serene reappeared. The queen will see you now. They entered a vast chamber with a ceiling so high it seemed to vanish into shadows. The floor was polished stone reflecting like still water. At the far end, upon a dais of crystalline steps, stood a throne that appeared carved from a single enormous gemstone. And upon it sat Queen Zenaya of the Silani. She was magnificent and terrible in her beauty. Tall even for a Silani, her blue skin several shades darker than Leandra's. Her hair, silver with age but still thick and lustrous, was arranged in an elaborate crown-like structure, adorned with living flowers that bloomed and closed in rhythmic patterns. Her golden yellow eyes held the wisdom and hardness of one who had ruled for decades. Mark approached the throne and bowed deeply, maintaining his grip on Leandra's hand. She followed reluctantly, body tense with instinctive wariness. Your Majesty, Mark said in formal court dialect, I am Mark Chen, formerly of Earth. I come bearing a gift beyond price, the return of that which was lost. Queen Zenaya's gaze shifted from Mark to Leandra, expression revealing nothing. You claim this creature is my daughter? Her voice was deep and melodious, but cold as void. I do, Your Majesty, Mark replied steadily. I found her living wild in the mountains to the northwest, surviving alone for 12 years. She has forgotten much, but she is remembering. The royal markings on her shoulder are genuine, as your physicians will confirm. The queen rose from her throne, movements graceful despite advanced age. She descended the crystal steps with measured pace, approaching Leandra with evaluating eyes. If this is truly my daughter, she said, why does she cower like a beaten animal? Why does she clutch the hand of a human as if he were her lifeline? The Princess Leandra was proud and strong, educated in our finest traditions. That princess was a child when she was lost, Mark said boldly. This Leandra has survived horrors we can only imagine. She has been alone, fighting for her life every day, with no language, no community, no comfort. That she survived it all is testament to her strength. The queen circled them slowly, gaze never leaving Leandra's face. Look at me, creature, she commanded. Leandra, responding to the tone rather than words, raised her eyes to meet the queen's. Something flickered in Zanaya's expression, a momentary softening, quickly suppressed. I see nothing of my daughter in those eyes, the queen declared. Only animal cunning and fear. She turned to Serene. Have the royal physician perform the lineage test. If this is an impostor, both she and the human will face justice for this deception. And if she is genuine, Mark dared to ask. Queen Zanaya's gaze was ice. Then we shall see what can be salvaged of the princess. She returned to her throne, dismissing them with a wave. Take them to the examination chambers. As they were led from the throne room, Mark felt growing unease. He had expected surprise, perhaps disbelief, but not this cold evaluation. The queen had looked at her own daughter as if examining damaged property rather than a child miraculously returned. The examination chamber was sterile, lined with equipment combining medical technology with ritual implements. The royal physician, an elderly Solani male with intricate patterns covering his skin, instructed Leandra to sit on a central platform. She refused, backing away until bumping into Mark. She trusts you, the physician observed. Perhaps you can convince her to cooperate. Mark knelt before Leandra, taking both her hands. Leandra, these people need to confirm who you are. The test won't hurt. I'll stay right here. She studied his face, then looked at the physician and platform. After hesitating, she allowed Mark to lead her to it. The examination was brief but thorough. The physician took blood and skin samples, examined the tattoo with special instruments, and scanned her brain activity. Throughout, Leandra remained tense but cooperative as long as Mark stayed beside her. Finally, the physician stepped back. There is no doubt, he announced solemnly. The genetic markers of the royal house are present and authentic. The cranial structure matches our records. The tattoo contains specific trace elements of royal ink. He bowed toward Leandra. This is indeed Princess Leandra, daughter of Queen Zenaya and the late King Taral. Mark felt vindication, quickly followed by concern. What happens now? The queen must be informed, the physician replied. Then the princess will be taken to the royal quarters for rehabilitation. I should stay with her, Mark said quickly. She trusts me. I can help with her transition. The physician looked sympathetic but firm. That is not for me to decide. Humans are not permitted in the royal quarters. Before Mark could protest, Serene returned with royal guards. Her expression was troubled. The queen has been informed, as she said. She commands that the princess be brought to the royal bathing chambers immediately to be cleansed and properly attired. The human is to be escorted to guest quarters until the queen determines his reward. No, Mark said firmly. Leandra isn't ready to be separated from me. She doesn't understand what is happening. Serene's expression hardened. These are the queen's commands. They are not subject to negotiation. The guards moved forward, reaching for Leandra. She reacted instantly, survival instincts taking over. With a feral growl, she leapt from the platform, placing herself between Mark and the guards, teeth bared in aggression. Stop! Mark shouted, placing a restraining hand on Leandra's shoulder. You'll only make it what if you try to force her? Serene hesitated, then motioned for the guards to step back. What do you suggest, human? Let me go with her, Mark said. Let me stay until she's more comfortable. I can help explain things, help her understand who these people are. The royal bathing chambers are sacred spaces, Serene objected. No male, let alone a human, has ever... Then wait outside, Mark interrupted. But let me take her there. Let me explain. Don't separate us yet. Serene considered, then nodded reluctantly. Very well, but you will remain outside while female attendants see to the princess. This arrangement is temporary until the queen decides otherwise. With Mark's guidance, Leandra allowed herself to be led to the royal bathing chambers, a marvel of architecture with pools at different temperatures, fed by natural hot springs. Steam rose carrying the scent of unfamiliar herbs. Female attendants waited with shimmering robes and cleansing oils. Leandra balked at the entrance, nostrils flaring at unfamiliar scents. Mark squeezed her hand reassuringly. "This is part of who you were," he told her. "These women will help you remember. I'll be right outside. If you need me, call my name." She looked from him to the waiting attendants, then back. "Mark," she said clearly. "Yes," he smiled. "Mark, I'll be close." With visible reluctance, Leandra allowed herself to be led inside. The doors closed behind her, leaving Mark alone with Serene in the antechamber. "You care for her," the steward observed neutrally. "I've spent weeks keeping her alive, helping her find her way back to humanity," Mark replied. "Of course I care." Serene's expression softened slightly. "You should prepare yourself. Once the princess is restored to her proper place, your role in her life will end. The queen will reward you, but you will not remain in the palace." Mark had known this, but hearing it stated so bluntly sent a pang through his chest. What will happen to her? Will she be given time to adjust, to continue her recovery? "That is for the queen to decide," Serene replied. "But our people have long memories, and we have waited 12 years for the princess's return. There will be expectations." Before Mark could respond, a commotion erupted from within. There were shouts, splashing water, and a crash as something heavy fell. The doors burst open and a soaking wet Leandra appeared, eyes wild with panic. She had been partially cleaned, her blue skin showing more clearly, but had clearly fought off the attendants. "Mark!" she cried, rushing to his side and clinging to him. The attendants appeared, elegant robes drenched and disheveled. "She fought us when we tried to submerge her head," one explained, a cut bleeding on her cheek. "She doesn't understand the cleansing rituals." Mark held Leandra close, feeling her trembling. "It's all right, you're safe." He looked up at the frustrated attendants. She spent 12 years avoiding water except to drink. Being held under, even briefly, must have triggered survival panic. Serene sighed heavily. "This is more challenging than anticipated. Perhaps you should assist, human. Guide her through the process." The next hour was a delicate dance of patience and persuasion. With Mark present, speaking softly and demonstrating each step, Leandra gradually allowed the attendants to continue. He showed her how to immerse herself without fear, how the oils would clean without harm. When it came time to wash her hair, he knelt beside the pool and supported her head himself, ensuring she never felt trapped. As layers of dirt were washed away, the true Leandra emerged. Her blue skin was the pale shade characteristic of royalty, with subtle natural patterns previously obscured. Her hair, once fully cleaned, proved to be striking silver blue, falling in waves to her waist. Her features showed her lineage clearly, the high cheekbones and delicate jawline marking her as the queen's daughter. The attendants, initial frustration forgotten, worked with renewed enthusiasm as the princess's true appearance emerged. They applied scented oils to her skin and hair, wrapped her in robes of fabric so fine it seemed to float, and placed simple but elegant jewels at her throat and wrists. When finished, Leandra stood before a polished metal mirror, staring at her reflection with confused wonder. She raised a hand to touch her own face as if unable to reconcile this clean, adorned person with her sense of self. "Leandra," she said softly, touching her reflection. "Yes," Mark agreed, standing behind her. "Princess Leandra." She turned to look at him, eyes filled with questions she couldn't yet articulate. But before Mark could try to answer, Serene approached, expression grave. "The queen commands your presence in the throne room," she announced. "Both of you, immediately." Mark felt apprehension surge. "Why the urgency?" "It is not my place to question the queen's commands," Serene replied, but her eyes held warning. "We must not keep Her Majesty waiting." They were escorted back to the throne room, Leandra now drawing gasps of recognition from palace staff. The transformation in her appearance was remarkable, but her movements and posture remained those of a wild creature, wary, ready for flight or fight. The throne room was no longer empty. Court members had assembled, nobles and officials standing in formal arrangements by rank. Queen Zanaya sat upon her throne, expression unreadable, as Mark and Leandra were led before her. A hushed murmur swept through the assembled Selani as they beheld the transformed princess. Even the queen's composed facade cracked slightly, her eyes widening, but when she spoke, her voice remained cold. So, the tests confirm this is indeed my daughter. The physical resemblance, now that she has been properly cleansed, is also evident. Mark bowed. As I told your majesty. The queen's gaze hardened. Yes, you have returned the body of my daughter. But what of her mind, her spirit, her royal training? She rose, descending to stand directly before Leandra. Look at her. She stands like a beast, eyes darting, muscles tense to flee. This is not a princess. This is a wild animal wearing my daughter's form. Leandra seemed to sense the criticism, if not exact words. She shrank back, moving closer to Mark. She needs time, Mark argued. She's already made remarkable progress. She's speaking a few words, understanding more every day. With patience. Patience, Hyson, the queen interrupted sharply. For 12 years I have waited. For 12 years this court has been without its heir. The Selani people have been without their future queen. She turned to address the courtiers. Our enemies watch for any sign of weakness in the royal line. We cannot afford to present them with a feral child in place of a princess. Murmurs of agreement rose. The queen continued, voice rising. The law is clear. Any member of the royal house deemed unfit to represent the dignity and power of our lineage must be removed. Permanently. Mark stared in horror. You can't be serious. She's your daughter. My daughter died 12 years ago in the Scarlet Wastes, Queen Zenaya replied hollowly. This creature that wears her form is an embarrassment to the royal house, a potential weakness our enemies would exploit. She turned to the royal guards. Take the princess to the ritual chambers. The ceremony of transition will be performed at dawn. What ceremony? Mark demanded, though fearing the answer. Serene replied, voice heavy with regret. The ritual ending of a royal life that has become untenable. You're going to execute her? Mark's voice rose in disbelief. Your own daughter, because she doesn't meet your standards after surviving 12 years alone in the wilderness? The queen's eyes flashed. You forget yourself, human. This is not your world, not your culture, not your concern. You have completed your task. You will be rewarded as promised, then escorted from the city. No, Mark said firmly, placing himself between Leandra and the approaching guards. I won't let you kill her for the crime of survival. The queen's expression hardened further. Guards, remove the human. If he resists, execute him as well. The guards advanced, weapons raised. Mark prepared to fight, though hopeless. Beside him, Leandra tensed, sensing the danger though perhaps not understanding its full extent. And then something extraordinary happened. As the guards reached for Mark, Leandra stepped forward. Her posture changed, spine straightening, shoulders squaring. Though she still moved with a predator's fluid grace, there was suddenly something else in her arm, something regal. She looked directly at Queen Zenaya, her eyes clear and focused. She took another step forward, and the guards hesitated, uncertain. Leandra raised her hand, pointing at the queen. Her face contorted with effort, the struggle to form words evident in every line of her expression. And then, from her throat emerged a sound, hoarse, barely audible, but unmistakable. Mamo, the Selani word from mother. The throne room fell silent. Queen Zenaya froze, her commanding presence suddenly shaken. She stared at Leandra as if seeing her truly for the first time. Leandra took another step forward, hands still outstretched. Mamo, she said again, stronger this time. A tear slipped down her blue cheek, perhaps the first she had shed in years. The queen's composure cracked, then shattered. With a cry that held 12 years of suppressed grief, she rushed forward and fell to her knees before her daughter. Her regal headdress tumbled to the floor, formal robes pooling around her as she reached for Leandra's hands. My child, she whispered, voice breaking. My Leandra. Leandra looked down at the kneeling queen with confusion, but something stirred in her expression, a flicker of recognition or a distant memory surfacing. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and touched her mother's face, mirroring the gesture Mark had used to comfort her. Her fingers traced the line of the queen's jaw, the curve of her cheek, the wetness of tears on blue skin. "Mamo," she said a third time, and now the word held certainty. The queen pulled Leandra into her embrace, 12 years of royal dignity forgotten, as she wept openly before her court. The assembled Zelani watched in stunned silence, witnessing a miracle none had thought possible. Mark stood apart, his heart full. This was what he had hoped for, not just Leandra's physical return, but the awakening of her true self, the reclaiming of her identity and place. Eventually, the queen composed herself enough to rise, though keeping one arm firmly around Leandra's shoulders. She turned to face the court, face streaked with tears but voice steady. "The princess has returned to us," she announced. "Not lost, but found. Not gone, but reborn. She will need time to recover fully, to relearn our ways, our language, our traditions. But she has already shown the strength and resilience that marks a true daughter of the royal house." She looked at Mark, her expression transformed completely. Where before there had been cold disdain, now there was gratitude and respect. "Human," she said, using his species not as an insult, but as a title of honor. "You have done what none of our search parties could achieve. You have brought back not just the body of my daughter, but her spirit as well. You recognized her worth when she appeared as nothing more than a wild creature. You treated her with dignity and patience when many would have seen only a beast." Queen Zenaya stepped forward, regal bearing restored but now tempered with humanity. "Mark Chen of Earth, you are hereby granted the status of royal friend, the highest honor we can bestow upon a non-Zelani. You will be welcome in the palace and in my daughter's presence for as long as she needs you to complete her journey home." Mark bowed deeply, overcome by this unexpected turn. "Thank you, Your Majesty. It has been my honor to serve the princess and to witness her courage." Leandra moved from her mother's side to stand before Mark. With deliberate care, she placed her hand over his heart, a gesture she had learned during their journey, a sign of trust and connection. Then, to the astonishment of the entire court, she spoke again, this time in carefully formed English. "Mark, friend." "Yes," he agreed, his own eyes damp with emotion. "Friends."